Welcome, international best-selling and award-winning romance fantasy author, Freya Marske. Yay!
Hello.
I'm so thrilled to have you on the show, Freya, because I know that I've had a lot of requests for sapphic romances and a little bit of world building. So in case listeners don't know, can you tell them a little bit about yourself and your writing?
Yes. So I'm an Australian author of sci-fi, fantasy, and romance, and the messy bits where all of those intersect. My debut novel came out last year. That was A Marvelous Light. And it was the first in a queer historical fantasy series where each book builds on the plot, but it also features its own new queer romance. And book two is just released, A Restless Truth, and it is a sapphic romance, the second installment in the series.
And as you mentioned, A Restless Truth, which is the next book in the Last Binding trilogy, is a historical fantasy filled with magic and mayhem and just lots of intrigue. And it's set in the Edwardian period, from what I kind of understood. When I
Yep.
usually think of historical fantasy, my mind automatically goes to Victorian era. So, did you always intend for the book to be in the Edwardian time period?
It's a bit of a chicken and the egg story, that one. So essentially, yes. And you're right that the Victorian era, I think the aesthetics of it, the vibe, the world building in inverted commas, is a bit more familiar, especially to a historical romance audience.
Mhm.
I probably secondary only to the Regency in terms of it being an accepted time period where people know the social norms in England, at least, and are familiar with romances that are set in that time. It's interesting. I've seen a few reviews online where people have described A Marvelous Light as a Regency fantasy, because I think in their head that's just like, oh, it's a historical fantasy. We just use Regency as a title, because I think Bridgerton has now become the watchword by which people understand historical romance,
Mm.
at least, which always amuses me a little bit when I see it. I'm like, it's definitely, we're a century later than the Regency. But the fact that people are reading in the genre means I'm not going to nitpick too hard. So when I was deciding where to set the books, this trilogy came together in pieces. I had a few ideas for romances that were bouncing around in my head, and I knew that some of them had fantasy elements possible. And my agent had come back to me when we were wildly bombing on submission with my first novel, saying, you need to pick fantasy or romance in terms of who we're submitting these to. So if they're going to be fantasies, they need to have magic in them. Because my first book didn't have magic, but it was technically a secondary world fantasy. So I thought, right, I've got all these disparate romance ideas. I think I can squish them together to create a fantasy trilogy of romances, stealing that structure from historical romance, which obviously does that really, really well, where you have a series, each book has its own couple, and there might be an intrigue plot or a fantasy plot or something that develops across the series. It's not done as much in fantasy genre, so I really enjoy getting to play with that. And then the reason it's in the Edwardian era is because I knew that book two, Restless Truth, the one that just came out, was going to be on a boat. And I knew it was going to be an ocean liner around the time of the Titanic. That was the idea that I had had from the beginning, was a sapphic romance set on an ocean liner. And so the story I'm telling in book one, With a Marvelous Light, the romance itself probably could have been set in almost any time period, just going by the kinds of characters that they are and the archetype that they are. Book three became a lot more of the time, like it became much more influenced by the era that I'd chosen when I was writing it. But A Restless Truth is the reason that it's in the Edwardian era, which is this strange little, I think it's only just a decade, maybe a bit more or less, sandwiched between the Victorian era, so like the late Industrial Revolution, and World War One. So it's a very odd little time. Most people understand it through pop culture now as the time when Downton Abbey started, because Downton Abbey famously begins with the sinking of the Titanic. When I thought, okay, this would be an interesting place to set it, because it is this slightly underused time. And it means you can use all of the Victorian stuff, but you have some changing fashions. You have bicycles, you've got more motor cars. There's just a little bit of shift from one aesthetic of history to another. And there's a lot of social shift as well that I actually discovered a lot more about when I started researching the period.
And it seems like it was tailor-made. I haven't caught up with the whole series and I haven't read A Marvelous Light quite yet, but I did read A Restless Truth, which like you said, you always had that idea that it was going to be in the Edwardian period with that specific book. And it did seem like that's the only place I could see that like perfectly because it just fit it so well.
I'll be so interested to hear what you think about going back to A Marvelous Light after having read A Restless Truth first. I mean, obviously, you know a bit about the plot, but you see the main characters of A Marvelous Light only through Maud's eyes in book two. So, you know, they're sort of negative space on the page and then they appear a little bit at the end, but that would be a very interesting thing. I'm sure some people will do that. I'm hoping that some people will pick up book two and enjoy it and go back to book one and then be ready for book three next year. But I imagine it's quite a different reading experience.
And it's so interesting to me that you said that you actually ended up blending a bunch of like those kind of storylines, those pieces, when you were originally trying to pitch a book to other publishers. Because to me, you did such a great job of balancing all of that together, like all of that, the historical piece, the magic piece, and there's even some humor, which I didn't expect, which was amazing. And then also there was all these wonderful tropes, of like Maud being the very naive and inexperienced, let me put it that way. And Violet was very experienced and worldly. So, like, how did you do a great
Mm.
job of balancing everything?
Great care. No, I think I do a lot of outlining, which
Ah,
I think saved me. Like I knew very deliberately I wanted to be doing a proper romance with the romance beats. Even though I think I messed around a little bit with the pacing of the romance in A Restless Truth. A Marvelous Light is much more classic in terms of where the beats fall, and there's a third act breakup or a dark moment at least, and then peril brings them back together. A Restless Truth, each romance I wanted to be slightly different in the tropes I was using and the kind of romance I was telling. And I only have 6 days. So I knew it wasn't going to be a for together, married forever kind of ending, but it would definitely be a happy for now with really showing the promise of what this romance could be. And so I had to think, all right, how many of the romance beats can I do and in what order in 6 days? And having that really tight time period actually helped me a lot with weaving together the 3 different arms of the story, because I knew, okay, I've got this murder mystery, which sort of transforms a little bit into a game of keep away and a heist. Like all the different intrigue things were quite clearly set out as to which days they were going to fall on. And then I've got, okay, what's going to happen in the morning? What's going to happen in the afternoon? I had to give everybody a schedule as to which parts of the peril were going to fall when. And then I had to weave the romance through that, letting it be influenced by what had happened. So if they've just been in peril, are they feeling very intimate? If they're feeling flushed with triumph, that they've had a minor victory in their heist/murder investigation, how will that influence the way they talk to each other and the kind of sex scene that they might have then? And I really enjoy doing that kind of work. Like I'm a very strong outliner in that I do a lot of work before I even start drafting. So that was really fun. And as for the magic, because I'd already built quite a lot of the magic for book one, it was just a matter of building on that and allowing myself to be a bit spontaneous and creative and just throw in extra bits of magic whenever I thought they would serve the story.
I love that you said you outlined because did you do a lot of research into it when, like, either prior to the outline or after the outline? Because it feels there was a bunch of details, wonderful details. And I know I went a long time ago to a Titanic showing, and it was very interesting to see like that time period of like all the different kind of types of things that they had historically.
I really enjoyed the research period for this book. I didn't want to over research. I'm very wary of over researching. And especially with book one, I kind of read a couple of books about the period and then went, okay, I'm just going to look up details as I need them. So I looked up things about the civil service for book one. I looked up things about when people had weekend holidays and what seasons and how that worked and what cars were available and that kind of thing. Book two, I wanted to be a lot more accurate in terms of some of the detail. Like these are not entirely accurate historical novels. Like because I'm working in fantasy, I allow myself a little bit of anachronism that if I was writing pure historical, I probably wouldn't be allowed to keep. But there's always, I'm going to be getting some things wrong. I'm sure there are people out there reading it being like, she got that very wrong because I just didn't research the right detail. But I really wanted the setting of the ship to feel vivid and real. So I did a lot of research on the Titanic. The ship in the book, the Lyric, is an imaginary ship. It didn't exist, but it is very, very similar to most of the White Star Line ocean liners of that time. It is a bit smaller than the Titanic, but I stole quite a lot of the Titanic's features to put in the lyric. So it's sort of this imaginary boat that is sandwiched between some of the other liners of the time before the Titanic was built. So in my head, they're sort of playing around with some of those features like the Turkish baths and the French cafe and the gymnasium and all these weird things that were actually on the Titanic that I came across in my research and decided that I had to steal and put in the book. Because if you're writing something that's so locked room as being set just on a ship, when you come across something that's a more interesting setting than they're on the deck or they're in the dining hall or they're in a cabin, you have to use it, to make sure that there's variety and that the story feels like it's moving along and exploring the whole space. So I did a lot of research on what the actual furnishings were like in the Titanic. Like I managed to find an amazing website of a small museum that had done a Titanic exhibit ages ago, but someone had put a lot of work into the online features of the exhibit website. And they had pictures, like old black and white photos of the interior of the rooms, like the first class staterooms and like the library, the smoking room, most of it sort of focusing on the first and second class things. I think that's what everyone's kind of interested in. Like everyone's a little less interested in what conditions were like in the third class rooms because they were fairly plain. That was mass transport, but all of the point of the White Star Line was that they were selling the luxury of first class to a certain class of person. And so that was the furnishings that I had to play with. And the research for that was a lot of fun.
Well, and you did such a fabulous job because everything felt so vivid. Like you were saying, since you are so contained in a small setting or a smaller setting, say like on a ship, you did a fantastic job of, as readers, when we were going through, you were describing certain things. It was very visceral in a way that felt like I could just easily lose myself in the book. And I love that, especially for fantasy. I love when like the worlds are built out and crafted so adventurous and fun and they're just fully realized. How did you approach world building a historical fantasy? Did you actually start with the characters or did you kind of start with the world and or magic itself?
So I think it did start with the characters, at least for book one.
Mm.
And I had different ideas for who I had certain ideas for who might be the characters in books 2 and 3 that had to change because of the way book 1 turned out. So when I first envisaged it, the characters that we meet in books 2 and 3, we weren't going to meet them until their own books. And then I thought, well, that's not going to work at all. Like in romance, especially, you want to introduce somebody a book beforehand so that people are like, oh, when's their book coming? I'm interested in this person. And fantasy-wise, it just wasn't going to work, especially because I have in each book somebody who's a magician and somebody who is new to magic relatively and not a magician themselves. And if I did that every single time, I'd have to do the headache of showing someone, be like, oh my God, magic exists, wow, 3 times in a row. And that would just be very boring for the reader. And it would also mean that I have to sort of reiterate the entire plot to that point, which was not going to be interesting for anybody. So when I started thinking about it as a trilogy and a fantasy trilogy, and once I had an idea of what the plot that held the 3 books together was going to be, I then thought about how I was going to weave those characters into the earlier books. So you meet Maud in book 1. Violet is entirely new. And then by the time we get to the end of book 2, you have already met both of the narrators of book 3. So at least there is a familiarity and you'll be able to just plunge in and be like, yes, I know who these people are. These people know what the plot is, more importantly. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. So characters in the romance was sort of the backbone of my story building. When it comes to the world, it really was a matter of just doing that historical research, deciding which bits were vital, mostly based on vibes, and which bits were allowed to be massaged slightly in the name of fantasy and anachronism. And then the magic just got piled on top of that. The magic was the thing I let myself be the most free about when I was writing. I didn't really outline a great deal about the magic for book 1. And then book 2, I just threw in whatever I thought was fun. And then in book 3, that all came back to bite me in the butt because I had to do a lot of stuff around the world building of the magic and start clarifying points that I had left hand wavy, because book 3 is where the fantasy plot really like sinks its teeth in and culminates. And so I had to understand the magic system a lot more to write book 3. So that was a bit of a headache, but it was fun and very satisfying once it all came together.
I love that you use the method too of already introducing these characters. So as readers, we already have an investment when we go to the next book and we kind of want to see that. Because those are some of my favorite books. Like I'm just like, I read a book and I'm like, I want them to have their own love story. And then of course there's like, aha, but they do in the very next book.
They do. Well, I mean, I feel like anybody who's coming from the world of romance will read A Restless Truth and get the end and be like, right, okay, I recognize what you're doing here. I think I can see who the book 3 pairing is. Whereas I'm getting a lot of feedback from fantasy people who are sort of like, is it this person? I really hope this person gets a book. I'm like, well, if you are familiar with what romance series do, you would realize the answer is, oh, yes.
Of course, that's how we're setting it up. But and it's also a really cool way because now that you say that, like I said, I haven't had the privilege yet, but I'm definitely going to go back and read a Marvelous Light. And you were mentioning you had a pairing of the non-magic and the magic person. But you did a really great job of doing, because Maud was already, like you said, Maud was already introduced to magic. So she was very aware, even though she has none of her own. So like that, you did a really great job of investing those characters already to where they are in this world of magic. So they were aware of it. You don't have to constantly, like you said, introduce it to us.
That was something that did change when I was writing book 1. Like Maud was on the page, but she wasn't having a great deal of things to do. And then she surprised me halfway through book 1 by being like, I'm going to turn up at this secondary location and cause trouble. Well, not trouble compared to the trouble she gets up to in book 2, but as far as Robin's concerned, just the appearance of his little sister is enough to cause trouble. And so once she was on the page and I could introduce her to magic, it became very obvious that she was the protagonist or one of the 2 protagonists of book 2.
Oh, so was she never the original protagonist of book 2, or was it always meant to be
No,
kind of
as I said, it
oh.
was going to be 2 different people who we hadn't met yet. But I think during the writing of book 1, it became obvious that I couldn't do that. I had to use somebody that we'd already met. There was a toss-up between using Maud and using one of the other female characters that I'd already introduced in A Marvelous Light. But just looking at the shape of things very, very early in the outlining, it became clear that I was going to use Maud.
And see, I know different writers and different readers too, who kind of sometimes they will start outlining a book and they're like, well, I didn't intend for this to happen. Like a new character takes over book 2, or it turns out what's going to be a standalone is a series. So how early, you said you started that in the outline, right? Of book 1, that you knew that the book 2, did you know there was going to be a book 3? Did you kind of already kind of chart that out?
Yep, I always knew there was going to be 3 books, and I was lucky enough to sell it to my publisher as a trilogy. Like there was
Oh,
no talk about turning it into a duology. Like it was always going to be a 3-book series. So I always knew I had 3 books to play with. And I'm a fairly firm writer in that once I have outlined something, it does not tend to stray a great deal from the outline when I'm writing it. In revisions, sometimes things will get tightened up. Like some things might change, especially around endings. I tend to sort of, my first draft endings are usually a bit like, that'll do. And then I have to fix them in revisions. But the shape of a story, where it goes, that's usually pretty set and doesn't tend to change much from my outline to the final product. Because I do really believe in the importance of outlining to keep my structure firm, to keep my pacing firm, to make sure all the beats are falling where they should be. There have been a couple of things that have surprised me, like, there's a thing that happens in A Marvelous Light at the midpoint that I hadn't quite thought through the implications of. And then when I thought, that would be interesting if it happened, I realized that by letting it happen, I had changed quite a lot of the second half of the book, not necessarily in terms of the structure of the plot, but where it was going to take place and the meaning of it to the characters. And then that has then influenced the fact that the books are quite strongly about magical houses. At least book 1 has like this introduction to magical houses. Book 3 is intensely about magical houses. Book 2 is a bit of an outlier because it's on a boat.
fair enough.
I like the book, the trilogy has quite a symmetrical shape. Like it begins in a place, it goes somewhere very different from book 2, and book 3 comes back not quite to the same place, but to some of the same settings and to some of the same themes that the first book has. So it gives you this opportunity to sort of follow you through a journey, but it should feel like the third book is taking you back to familiar things that you're seeing with new eyes, which I think is a good thing for a series to do. Like a series that starts in one place and then finishes somewhere completely different and is using the third book to completely introduce new people, new things, is a bit of a risk. Like I do introduce quite a lot of magical world building in book 3, but I wanted to ground it in things that the readers would find familiar from book 1 so that they didn't feel like I was just tossing everything I've done so far out the window. I wanted them to feel safe so that I could then take them on the next step.
Well, what a great method is kind to take the reader back to kind of the original, kind of the genesis, right, of the book, of the original series, and then kind of seeing it with fresh eyes, like you said, seeing it all anew. And now that we know all this other history and things have happened and progressed with the stories, we can go back and see like maybe a totally different view of this world. I'm very interested because it does seem like you did a great job of like where all the world building seems to build upon itself, the characters and the world, and like really make this very dynamic book as far as like your characters and the magic system and everything. So I'm very excited to see what happens in book 3.
Thank you. It was very satisfying to write. We'll see how much it changes in revisions. It is with my editor at the moment,
Ah,
but I had a really good time, and it was the romance that I've been looking forward to writing since I was planning the trilogy. So that was really satisfying.
oh, really? Because I did love Maud and Violet a lot.
Oh, I love all of them. Like
Oh,
any couple that I'm writing, I'm like, these are my favorites,
oh,
of course. So because I've just finished drafting book 3, of course, I'm going to be like, well, those ones were my favorites as well.
of
But
course.
obviously all of them are quite different couples, different characters, and I love all my children equally.
Oh, yes, there you go. As a writer, right? Like I was saying, because and you mentioned too that there's a lot of magic in there and like there's callbacks to the original. In the third book, there will be a callback to the first book and like seeing all these houses. And there's a lot of different characters that have been either introduced to us or we already know. And I've heard several writers tend to keep book Bibles, especially when building out like fantasy or anything, maybe even historical, where you have to kind of chart like where everyone is, where all the players are in the books at any given time or their history. Do you have a method of kind of keeping track of your world and the magic and all the characters?
The magic, no, the magic I just carry around in my head,
Ah,
unfortunately. Um, I haven't like been keeping a list of like spells that people do or things that have been made possible, although that is quite a good idea. But I tend to just sprinkle the magic through as I'm writing the draft and then hit the last quarter and go, right, what have I created that I can use here? And the same with book 3. Like I enjoyed doing some callbacks to magic that has been used in books 1 and 2 as part of book 3 to make people feel that I'm not just creating something new every time.
hmm,
Characters, I have character sheets in Scrivener. So I use Scrivener for outlining and drafting. And then I just have character sheets that may start fairly bare bone, but because I do character focused planning, I'll put in things like, okay, who are their family members? What are they called? What were the relative ages? And then like anything that I've come up with about their backstory, their personality, their driving motives. But those are really for the main players. And I know where all my main players are at all times. And once we hit book 3, we've got the 6 narrators. Well, no, there are only 2 narrators in book 3, but the main characters of books 1 and 2 are on page a lot of the time, as are several other main secondary characters. So they were pretty easy to keep track of because I managed to keep them mostly geographically in the same place. But I don't realize how many minor characters I've created until I get sent the cast sheet for the audiobooks, or at least the list of characters in the audiobooks. And they'll say, is this it? Have we got everybody? And it's just page after page of random, like one-line servants that say something, or somebody who is a shopkeeper. And I have to look through it and make sure I haven't accidentally doubled up on names. So I could probably make life easier for myself. And if I was writing a very long series, I probably would keep a character list of those minor characters, but I think I've managed to get away with it given that there are only 3 books.
well, and you did mention in book 3, I mean, that's a great method. I love Scrivener, so I will always say that that is a great method for, like, kind of taming my imagination and, like, helping me give an easier way to kinda chart out my books or anything like that or any outlines like you
Mm.
mentioned. And you mentioned something about, like, different narrators in book 3. Are we going to have different points of view? Are you going to write from different points of view, or is it mainly just two? I was just
It's
curious.
it's still just two. So
Okay.
every book is still that romance thing of just having two narrators, and we who are the ones who are in the romance, and we get their perspectives and nobody else's. So we have alternating points of view between the two. But it did become a lot more challenging with book 3 because instead of the people being on page just being the main romantic leads, which in A Marvelous Light, Robin and Edwin are on page together most of the time, or they're doing their own things, but there aren't any very significant other players. Like there's people that they're investigating, there's people as family members around, but they are the ones investigating the mystery and falling in love and going around and having adventures. And so it was very easy to balance a romance in that case because it was very much just those two against the world. In A Restless Truth, I had to expand that a little, especially because there's less of the surrounded by horrible people and more surrounded by people who are just people, who could be suspects or could be friends or could just be living their own life and their own story while on this ship. And so there was a lot more people walking in and out of various scenes. And I also had to set up a couple of other characters who are going to be part of the ensemble. So obviously, it's not just Maud and Violet doing this on their own. Maud being the person that she is, she has also managed to recruit Lord Hawthorne and Alan Ross and a couple of other people to be part of the investigation. And so I had to have a lot more of, you're in somebody's point of view, but there's 4 people in this conversation. And that was even harder in book 3 because suddenly there are 7 people in the conversation and involved in the planning. And I have a lot more respect for the script writers of shows like Leverage, where there's this relatively large central ensemble. And the way you deal with that is by breaking them up into little subgroups and letting these 2 people go off and do this job and have a conversation. And I could do that, but I could only do it as long as one of my narrators was one of the people going off and having that conversation. So there's a lot more just using the narrators to tell you what's happening with a large group of people who are planning a heist, essentially.
I didn't even think about that because you're right. The way you kind of balanced it with the ensemble kind of come flowing in and out for A Restless Truth, because they were kind of just milling about or they were around at the time in the ship and kind of the periphery of our protagonists. But to have like to be sure to balance when you have one point of view, like other conversations between several different people is definitely a tricky point, right? To be in as a
Yes.
writer.
Yep. It felt like I had built myself. Luckily, that was book 3. I felt like I had just slowly been lifting weights all through book 1 and book 2, and I had gotten myself to the point where I could carry that much on the page in the drafting process for book 3.
Well, and so that brings up a really interesting question when you say that, because that was something I was curious about is has since I've kind of came in on book 2, which was amazing, has the magic evolved with the book trilogy as it's kind of gone along?
Yes, there's gotten more pieces. And especially because book 1, one of the points of view you see is Edwin's, and Edwin has a very systematic mind and thinks about magic in a very systematic way. And Robin is being introduced to magic via Edwin. So
Mm.
the glimpse you get of how magic works is very logical and academic, and there are these glimpses of wonder and stuff that we don't quite understand happening around the edges. Book 2, Violet thinks about magic in a different way, especially because she has spent some time in America among people who do magic slightly differently and is now going back to England. And we get a slightly larger sense of how magic works in the world. Like, I don't go into detail on how it works in other countries and other cultures, but we just get that little glimpse that, okay, the British way is not the only way of doing things. And perhaps there are people who have been experimenting with magic even in England. Like, we hear about the Forsythia Club, the old women who are now old women, but were young women in the Victorian era, who were doing unexpected and exciting and original things with magic. And by the time we get to book 3, the theme is really about questioning where magic comes from and what we're doing with it. And is this the best way for that to be operating when it comes to the potential for power to be misused or placed into the hands of people who are going to use it to exploit others?
Like, instead of, like, upping the ante and make it just kind of a all-powerful thing just continuing to grow, it's more of a question of, should we actually be using this and how should we be using it? That's really cool.
And
I
I
love
think
that.
all of the books have that
Mhm.
question in them somewhere. It's only in book 3 that it becomes really explicit.
Well, and the magic system that you did create for the book, felt very unique and felt clearly defined. So, was it actually influenced or based on anything in particular?
Not really. I just made it up. Like, the idea of cradling, so using string like a cat's cradle to do, was just something that had
Mhm.
come to me in a short story that I'd written ages ago. And the string itself was not involved at that point. I just wanted to use the verb cradling for magic that was done with gesture as a reference to cat's cradle. But and then I thought I really liked that idea. It just sort of hung around in the back of my head. And then when it came to write this book, I needed a magical system, and the idea of cradling was sort of strong in my head. And because it was quite important to me in book 1 to have a protagonist who was not all powerful, it was actually quite underpowered by the standards of magical society, that made me think about, well, what kind of person would that be? And what kind of things would he do in order to make the most of what little power and magic he has? And that brought me back to the idea of the string. And if you are going to base magic in gesture, how would you train somebody in that? And if it is actually to do with cat's cradle and string movements, you would probably still use that like training wheels on a bike if you didn't have enough magic to be able to overcome any kind of lack of precision. So that's where that came from. And then I just, yeah, built in bits and pieces of magic as I went. And there's some throwaway lines that I just came up with that grew into something bigger than a throwaway line because I liked their implication, or I was looking for things that I'd already included that I could then do something bigger with. So yeah, the magic was the most organic part of writing this trilogy.
Like you said, you took it, like, kind of organically, you kind of built off of this one idea and then kind of fully fleshed out more of the magical capabilities and what you would how you would actually go about it within your characters. Because that's really cool. It did feel like something I haven't quite seen before in a book, and I thought it was a fabulous idea because I was like, "That makes sense to me."
Yeah, I wanted it to feel kind of lived in, like lived in to a point that people have started getting a bit lazy about it. Like if the way that you do magic in this country has become so systematized, and it's expected that men do it, and here's the shorthand that we use to write down things, and of course you do it this way, and like the longer this that magicians have lived and done things one way, the more entrenched the system has become. And it's like learning different languages. If you only ever know one language, there are some concepts that just won't even come into your head because you don't know how to express them. And so the whole point of people starting to experiment with things outside of the quite rigid, traditional British magic system was to show that magic is a little bit deeper and different if you can think about it from a way that isn't the way you've been taught.
I did get the hints that there were some kind of subtext like that because I got the impression that there were some, like you were saying, some of like maybe the older magicians were kind of taking the magic for granted. Like they were, like you said, they
Mm.
were so entrenched into it that they kind of didn't see any other way but this way.
Part of that is also that what I said about it starting to become more important that it said in the Edwardian era is that it becomes about this idea of questioning the social status quo,
Hmm.
which is very much something that was happening during the Edwardian era with like we were starting to see that breakdown of those really, really rigid class boundaries in Britain that would then get shaken even further by World War One and the social changes that happened then. And so it's
Mm.
actually a very good time to set a story about questioning power and questioning the status quo, which is obviously something that happens in every point in history. And there's always people you can find everywhere, all around the world doing that. But for a British story, this seemed like a good time.
Well, and that's a great call out. I didn't even think about it with that specific context. I know you kind of mentioned like some of that in the book, but I didn't even think about it from that point of view because being American, I didn't even consider that that was also the same time period, like you said, that that was being like that the questioning of that class system, maybe not taken apart, but like kind of questioned in a way that people were
Yeah.
like, well, how does why should we have this? So.
Yeah. I mean, nothing is going to take apart the class system in Britain. It's still very much there. But
Yeah.
that whole like upstairs, downstairs, that very Victorian adherence to your position and your place. That was starting to be questioned a little bit as we had the emergence of a moneyed middle class, and, you know, like a lower middle class of office workers who were educated, but could never actually, you know, aspire to the upper classes. Yeah, it was an interesting time, and there's a lot of. I got to play with that a bit in book 3 because I'm playing with a narrator who was very upper class, and a narrator who was working class background who has kind of managed to scrape his way just into the lower middle class in terms of his occupation. And so they actually have a lot of conversations about politics, and I actually set a scene in the Houses of Westminster in book 3.
Ooh, that'll be very interesting to read and kind
Hmm.
of see how you go about that too. Cause that's a great point too. Cause I didn't even think about it. That's really a good time period. There was a lot of self-made millionaires and people coming up with money who had worked their way
Hmm.
to the top around that period of time.
Especially the Americans.
Yes, and that's what I was thinking of. I was thinking like the Rockefellers, I think, did that and like a bunch of like a bunch of the
Yeah,
self-made
so I had,
millionaires. Yeah.
that's what the, God, no, this is the thing, I can't keep track of my own characters' names. But yeah, I did have an American millionaire and his family coming across on the Lyric, like making the move from America to England. The Bernards, yeah,
Oh, thank you. Yes.
because that was something that happened, and, you know, there was a lot of movement, and, you know, and you had the Gilded Age going on in New York, and you had
Mhm.
Americans with money coming across to explore, you know, where could they fit into the society of Britain. And like the characters in this book, in the trilogy, are mostly upper to middle upper class. So
Mm.
we have two sort of titled aristocrats and one sister of an aristocrat, although they're sort of lower nobility. And then we have Edwin, who has his family has more money than class technically, but they still very much fit into that sort of upper middle class. And Violet as well is considered to be, you know, a gentleman's daughter in the same way that the people in Pride and Prejudice are gentlemen's daughters, even though they haven't really got much money. And so they actually, again, is of a certain class.
Mm.
And we only really have a working class character in the third book.
And you made reference to Violet and Maud, and theirs are the ones that's featured in our romance, that our lovely love
Yes.
story, yes, and our Sapphic romance between two lovely ladies. Maud's the ingenue falling for the experienced Violet,
Yes.
who yes, and we love that trope. We love those tropes. And it was fascinating to read about these dynamic characters navigating the Edwardian time period as queer individuals. Now, did historical representation of LGBTQ people in that era influence the ladies or the romance in their book?
Yes, absolutely. And you're right, it was really satisfying to do that, like, rake-wallflower, ingenue cad trope where both of
Mhm.
them are women, especially because I guess, like, a little bit of a messier romance, and, like, I've been describing it as the rake-wallflower speed run over 6 days, but I also wanted to deconstruct that trope a little bit because Maud obviously has a lot more, self-confidence and power than she thinks she does at the beginning of the book, and so which of them among them is the one who is the more confident and is actually steering the ship, changes through the course of the romance. But I really did want to do that initial sort of ingenue rake setup with women, and that was so much fun to play with. In terms of historical representation, I did do quite a bit of reading about this as well, and one of my favorite people that I came across, who I then included in the book as a reference, is Maud Adams. Who Maud was not named for. This is just a coincidence that her name is
Oh.
Maud, who is the American actress who originated the role of Peter Pan on Broadway. And so she would have been acting at the same time that Violet was in New York. And Maud Adams, I think it's pretty much accepted, was, if not a lesbian, at least very queer. And she had two long-term female partners throughout her life. She was one of the most like celebrated, well-paid, well-regarded actresses in New York over her life. At the time that this book is set, Maud Adams had just started living with her second long-term partner, Louise Boynton. So I had this like sneaky reference to maybe she and Violet had slept together. which may or may not have, happened given her partnership. I don't know what her personal life was like, but I loved reading about her life and the fact that the theatre has always been a place where queer people can find one another and find a little bit more freedom, and that's sort of the idea of the creative arts. So I really enjoyed thinking about her and not basing the characters on her, but just enjoying the fact that she existed. In terms of like historical fiction that was contemporary at the time, obviously there wasn't a great deal of queer fiction being written in the Edwardian era. And the main example and the most influential to me was Maurice by E.M. Forster, who was a gay man who wrote beautiful books. And Maurice was one of the earliest gay romances that had a happy ending. And so it was quite scandalous at the time that it was written that these people did not end in death or tragedy or separation. So his books obviously contain a bit of that societal and internal homophobia that people have to overcome in order to find happiness. And I was a little bit less interested in exploring that in these books. Obviously, I show that there are some societal expectations and societal pressure, but when it comes to the internal barriers for the romance, I didn't really want to put in a lot of sort of angst about sexuality. That wasn't really what I was interested in playing with, just showing that these people did exist in history and they did carve out happy lives for themselves.
I think that's what I found really lovely and refreshing about it is just because, like you said, it wasn't so much focused on the angst, and there are books that do that, but this book in particular just kind of, enjoyed where they were, right? They were just kind of living their lives, and there was just this acceptance of, like,
Mm.
them within themselves, right? For, like, because Violet was just like, "Well, I like men and women."
Violet
So
has already gone through her sort of self-questioning process by the time we meet her.
exactly.
Whereas Maud, like, this is really not quite a coming out story, but a coming to terms with yourself story
Mm.
for Maud. So she is actually having much more of a journey of discovery and questioning of her sexuality. And then being Maud, once she has decided to discover it, going at that with both hands, full speed, deciding that, right, this is something that I want. I'm going to see what it's like. Which was so much fun to play with, especially in the sex scenes, like that kind of joyful discovery exuberance that you see in a young person who has just hit that do I want to be her or do I want to fuck her stage.
Mhm. Take kind of a really different route with that ingenue falling for the experienced cad trope, when you have 2 ladies and like you said, it was almost kind of like a coming to terms.
Yes, so we have
Love that.
extremely determined ingenue and very wary cad.
I love it. Since we've talked so much about these books and A Restless Truth is now available, where can listeners find your books and how can they connect with you?
Well, hopefully you can find my books wherever books are sold. They definitely exist in ebook, in audiobook, and in print. And obviously, if your bookshop or your library doesn't have them, then I would super appreciate a request to have them ordered in, especially in libraries. Like I think supporting libraries is so important, especially now. And anybody who says, "Oh, I asked my library to request, to get your book in so I can read it that way because I can't afford to read it." Absolutely perfect, go for it. I think we should support libraries all we can. And in terms of connecting with me, I am most active on Twitter. That's probably where I do most of my self promo, my chatting about what I'm reading, what I'm writing. I do use Instagram as well, but mostly just to sort of keep track of things and to look at other people's beautiful pictures of my books. So I'm at Freya Marske on both Twitter and Instagram, and the website is just freyamarske.com, which contains a bit more information about short stories that I've written in the past and things like that.